Make sure you subscribe to my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday, you'll get an email from the Washington Times that takes you inside the ideas we discuss on the podcast. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter on Fridays. History as it happens, January 24th, 2023. Church committees.
We have a particular obligation to examine the NSA in light of its tremendous potential for abuse. It has the capacity to monitor the private conversations of American citizens without the use of a bug or attack.
Most of the senators now agree with Chairman Frank Church that the CIA has indeed been a rogue elephant out of control.
An act of insubordination within the CIA that came to light only by the happenstance that Mr. Colby, the present director, asked the agency if they please wouldn't tell him what's been going on that's wrong.
Nearly 50 years ago, the Senate, with bipartisan backing, investigated the egregious abuses of the intelligence agencies, from spying on Martin Luther King to assassinating foreign leaders. The Church Committee went down in history for what it told Americans and the reforms it led to. Today, House Republicans say they'll lead a new Church Committee to investigate the weaponization of the government against conservatives. Echoes of the 1970s or a made-for-cable TV partisan circus? That's next as we report history as it happens. Podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's not a ploy when the FBI pays Twitter $3 million. Not one, not two, $3 million to censor American citizens.
What the Church Committee found is that you had people, you had those feminist groups, you had Martin Luther King Jr., you had Muhammad Ali, you had Supreme Court justices, people who were just engaged in their, many times like their First Amendment rights to petition the government for a redress of evil, or Supreme Court justices who were just writing opinions. This has nothing to do with what Jim Jordan is talking about.
On September 16, 1975, an unexpected scene played out in the historic Senate caucus room, the same room where the Watergate hearings had been held 2 years before.
Chairman, on the particular dart used, there are different kinds of these flechettes that were used in various weapon systems, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to...
CIA Director William Colby testified before a panel investigating intelligence abuses that his agency once had a program to develop toxic agents at a lab at Fort Detrick in Maryland. And as the TV cameras rolled, Colby handed over a poison dart gun designed to fire a dart poisoned with a shellfish toxin. And the target would barely feel it in the few seconds of life left before the poison triggered a fatal heart attack.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman. The round thing at the top is obviously the sight. The rest of it is what is practically a normal .45, although it's special. However, it works by electricity. There's a battery in the handle, and it fires a small dart.
So that when it fires silently?
Almost silently, yes. Very little.
What range does it have?
100 meters. 100 meters, I believe, about 100 yards, 100 meters.
About 100 meters range.
Right.
We thank C-SPAN for its amazing audio vault here.
We have been victimized by excessive secrecy, not only with respect to the failure of the Congress in the past to exercise proper surveillance over intelligence activities, but also excessive secrecy has created this kind of mischief.
The dart gun exhibit may have been the most bizarre moment in the 16-month existence of the committee chaired by Idaho Democratic Senator Frank Church.
An act of insubordination within the CIA that came to light only by the happenstance that Mr. Colby, the present director, asked the agency if they please wouldn't tell him what's been going on that's wrong.
It reviewed thousands of documents and called 800 witnesses, mostly for private testimony, and the facts were devastating. While the CIA had plotted to overthrow governments and assassinate foreign leaders, the NSA and FBI had spied on American citizens, from Martin Luther King to women's groups. Here is Frederick Schwartz, the Church Committee's chief counsel.
In the area of women's liberation, report after report about meetings of women who got together to talk about their problems. Now, how the Bureau got this information is not entirely clear, but it's apparently by informants. So we have informants running all over the country, checking up about what housewives are talking about in their efforts to decide whether women should have a different role in the society.
Before the Church Committee was created in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, America's intelligence agencies had escaped serious oversight. Today, you can make the case for a new Church Committee, given everything that's happened in the global war on terrorism, for instance, or the way the FBI applies for warrants to conduct surveillance on U.S. citizens, after the FBI Inspector General did find significant errors and omissions in agents' applications to the FISA court during the Trump-Russia probe. House Republicans, now in the majority, say they've created a new Church Committee, but at this early stage it bears little resemblance to the one from 1975. The new panel, officially titled the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, will investigate officials, school boards, companies like Twitter, that supposedly targeted conservatives. It'll be chaired by Ohio Republican Jim Jordan, who defended his new gig against charges that it's a partisan ploy from the House floor.
A ploy? It's not a ploy when the Department of Justice treats parents as terrorists, moms and dads who are simply showing up at a school board meeting to advocate for their son or daughter. A ploy. It's not a ploy when the FBI pays Twitter $3 million, not one, not two, $3 million to censor American citizens. It's not a ploy when the Department of Homeland Security tries to set up a disinformation governance board, because we all know that the Department of Homeland Security can tell what's good speech and what is bad speech, what's I mean, you got to be kidding me. I tell you what, dozens of whistleblowers who've come talk to Republican staff on the Judiciary Committee don't think this is a ploy. That's why they came to talk to us. They know how serious this is.
Well, the Department of Justice has already informed Jordan that it will not hand over documents from ongoing investigations. Democrats say the new committee will act more like McCarthy, Joe, not Kevin, then Frank Church, who had broad bipartisan support for his investigation back in the mid-1970s. Well, we'll see, I guess. But now is a good time to remember what the first Church Committee actually did, with historian Sam Martin, who is the Frank and Bethine Church Endowed Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University. Who better to ask? She is the author of Decoding the Digital Church, Evangelical Storytelling in the Election of Donald J. Trump. Hello, Sam Martin.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I can hardly tell you.
Well, I found out that you are a listener to the podcast. Yeah. So does this mean I have to be nice to you now during this interview? I guess so. I'm nice to all my guests.
You know, long-time listener, first-time caller. What can I say?
That reminds me of my days listening to sports radio in New York City. Before we dig into the history of the original Church Committee, or the Church Committee, what goes through your mind when you see today's House Republicans talk about a new Church Committee?
In the state of Idaho, here in the state of Idaho, Frank Church is a person who passed away in the 1980s, but he's still an institution. He's still a person that, you know, you learn about when you take fourth grade history. He's one of the longest serving senators that ever was here. The largest public wilderness in the United States is named after him because he helped build it, and we call it the Frank Church Wilderness. It is a recreation area that Idahoans love to walk into, to camp and to hunt and to recreate. And so we know him as that. We know him as a champion. We know him as, you know, we're a very red Republican state at this point. We were a red Republican state when he was in Congress, and yet we remember him as a champion for all Idahoans, as a person who was able to work across the aisle and get things done, as an eloquent speaker, as a person who championed wide-ranging causes, was a great speaker, and who was a national security hero. And so when we hear the name Frank Church, we feel proud as Idahoans, and we live in a state that a lot of people have never been to, a lot of people confuse with places like Iowa or Ohio, and we have this person who did some pretty extraordinary things. And so much like people feel proud of their universities and protective of them, or, you know, proud of their heritage and protective of it, we feel proud and protective of Frank Church.
Well, that's quite a legacy that you just described. We'll get into some of that in a bit. I drove through Idaho once, the northern strip, on my way to Washington State when I drove cross country. Beautiful area of the country. So as I was preparing for this episode, I debated how much should I get into Frank Church himself and his personal history. Because, I think a lot about these past episodes, past eras, because it's my job. But to the ordinary person, Frank Church is a distant memory, if they can remember him at all. I mean, this is 50 years ago. And I think most people have a vague understanding. The 60s and the 70s were a really messed up time. We had Watergate, we had Vietnam, we had the Church Committee. So why don't we begin with then Frank Church himself, is what I'm trying to say here. Before he was a senator from Ohio, he fought in the Second World War, right? Why don't you give us a brief sketch of his background before he gets into politics?
Yeah, so Frank Church was a lifelong Idahoan. Idaho is actually one of the fastest growing states in the Union, so a lot of people are no longer lifelong Idahoans, but he was born in Boise in about 1924, and he grew up, sort of an idyllic childhood. He suffered from some childhood illnesses, but mostly had a good childhood. He was always a good student, among some of his teachers' favorites. An especially famous episode that foretold his future in politics that your listeners might enjoy hearing about was that when he was in high school English, his teacher had a thing that she would do on Fridays where students would bring in words that they would then deconstruct and think about and wonder what they meant. And Frank was especially into this particular assignment. And one time he brought in the word. Now, if you can remember what you were like when you were in high school, like what was the likelihood you would bring in a word like this? But he brought in the word anti-disestablishmentarianism.
Oh, the longest word, right?
Yeah, like what a word. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. And everybody, his classmates were just kind of appalled and had no idea. But Church didn't just sit there and let his teacher take it on. He really engaged and asked his classmates, okay, like look in the middle, like find the part of the word you can recognize. And so, like establishment, and helped the classmates like deconstruct that word. And so his teacher, years later still remembered Church as, the best student she'd ever had in high school, because he was always wanting to learn, even as he was pushing boundaries. Right? Just like a future politician. I want to learn, I want to take things in, I want to know things, but I'm going to push the boundaries. And so, by 1941, here was Frank Church in this small state of Idaho, but he enters the American Legion National High School Oratorical Contest. More than 100,000 students in the nation, juniors in the nation enter. Students from Chicago and New York and Kansas City and all around the nation enter. And this kid from Boise, Idaho wins. Frank Church, out of 100,000 students. That was pretty extraordinary. And he used his scholarship from winning that to enroll at Stanford. And he goes there for 2 quarters before he winds up in the Army in World War II.
He enlists in the Army in 42. You're right about that. He was born in 1924. So we're talking about a century ago.
And so, in the Army, he winds up in Asia. He winds up in Army intelligence. And that's worth underscoring right at the beginning of our conversation. He winds up in Army intelligence. He both was a pretty good soldier. He had a successful Army career, but he also found the things that he saw really difficult and really hard to digest. He was seeing the ways that the United States was starting to engage in what he perceived to be U.S. expansionism and imperialism, and he didn't like it. That position, the imperialism and the expansionism and the interventionist streak of the United States, that really pierced his heart, pierced his conscience, and it became something that he kept going back to. And so he started to develop those political positions. His papers show that he had early political positions, and they kind of aligned with FDR at the time and the New Deal and the things that were going on.
Yeah, I was going to ask if he was a New Deal Democrat, but to your point about his issues with American foreign policy during World War II and immediately after it, what specifically was his concern?
He really worried that the government intervention smacked of colonialism, a very concerning underbelly to what was happening. He perceived already early in his life that what the Americans meant to do was to westernize and colonize the part of the world that was not Anglo, that was not white. He saw that big business had an interest in opening those markets
in places like Asia, South America. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, right. Because when he was in the Army, he was not in the Western theater. He was in the Eastern theater. And he saw there were ways in which the United States was taking on a colonial form, and that what had happened in the Philippines and what had happened in other places like that were not going to be isolated events. They were going to continue. And that actually what did in fact happen, right, with the Korean War, what did in fact happen with the Vietnam War, what moved forward in history, in his gut, he already felt that, and it was very concerning to him.
So he gets elected to the U.S. Senate in 1956, and the United States is already involved in Vietnam at this point. I mean, we had supported the French War effort. That came to an end in 1954. And then, of course, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and then LBJ sends in the Marines in 1965. But at first, Frank Church supported the U.S. mission in Vietnam. What turned him against the war? Was it as simple that it didn't go as planned and as promised, or was there something deeper there?
I actually would quibble with your premise. Church actually worried about Vietnam from the start. You know, there's a huge biography that was written of Church by Leroy Ashby and Rod Gramer that really traces Church's trajectory through his time in Vietnam. I also had the opportunity to talk with Gary Wensky, who was the former executive director of the Church Institute here and who was a longtime colleague of Church's. Frank Church was always really very worried about too much interventionism. His position on Vietnam was always maybe a little bit tortured. And so it's probably more accurate to say that after Kennedy set the putsch in motion, he cared more about salvaging a bad situation than on reassessing bad policy.
That's 1963, just for folks who don't know.
Right.
The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the leader of South Vietnam in 1963, just shortly before Kennedy himself is assassinated.
So once that putsch is set in motion by Kennedy, there's a bad situation, and it was really always important to him to be a responsible public figure. We can think of the 60s as this time when there's this building American discontent and dissonance. And he was really a person who wanted to be an upstanding public figure. So he wants to salvage a bad situation. He doesn't want to go around constantly reassessing bad policy. And so he stays with this position for a long time, but he's always very uneasy about Vietnam. He's always worried behind the scenes with his staff that the government's being untruthful, that there's this war going on that's unwinnable and possibly unnecessary. If you look at the history in the summer of 1964, and in fact, Mr. Wensky, who I just mentioned, said that he was part of the effort. Frank Church called him and said, bring me the speech, right? I need this speech. And he ends up in this exchange with William Fulbright on the floor where he starts to publicly articulate a position against the war as early as 1964. And he says things in the speech like, the war in South Vietnam is their war, it's not our war. He and Fulbright start to really debate about what to do in Vietnam and says it's a bad idea to make this get bigger and bigger. But soon thereafter comes the Gulf of Tonkin.
That our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
Only two senators, the senator from Alaska and maybe the senator from Oregon, if my memory serves, voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
That's right. I just discussed that with your friend Jeffrey Engel. That was a blank check for the president to do as he wished in Vietnam.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
He votes for that, but voting for that really wasn't a signal that he'd had a change of heart. And there's a lot of research to support this, that you have the Gulf of Tonkin, you just have this swelling public support that comes behind the president. Same thing, 9/11, right? How many people after 9/11 supported the Bush administration, and very few people didn't vote for those resolutions, and then they want to take it back later. Well, same thing happened here. And so it's not so simple as to say he supported the war and then he opposed the war. As he was like so many other people, he was tortured about the war.
Reluctantly supporting his president.
Exactly. And so there's not a moment I can point to where I can say this changed his mind, right? He didn't watch the evening news and see Walter Cronkite change his mind and say, okay, now I changed my mind. I do know that his son, Forrester Church, was a student at Stanford, and was one of those young people who was a pacifist and really was against the war. And Frank Church was very close to that son, and they had long talks about it. And he really was influential on his dad. And a lot of people within Church's circle think that that ultimately really did influence his public change of heart. But also it was something that was a long process, just as it was true of so many people during that era who didn't start out in the anti-war movement.
So Vietnam is relevant to all of this. It's part of the context, part of the climate in the country that brings about the Church Committee. Of course, that was not the official name of the committee. So we have Vietnam and the nationwide anger at that war. And then we have Watergate, and the Senate Watergate investigation leads to the committee to investigate the intelligence abuses, one of which, to bring Vietnam back into the fold, was the FBI or CIA surveillance of anti-war dissent in the United States. But how does Frank Church come to chair this committee? And, well, I guess this is a two-part question. Sorry, Sam. How does Watergate lead to the committee, and then how does Church come to chair it?
It's easiest for me as the Frank and Bethine Church chair to think about your question with Frank Church as my main character. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer the question with Frank Church as my main character.
You may answer the questions any way you wish, since you're the expert here. You are the Frank Church chair, so yeah.
Well, if we think about what I was just speaking of, Frank Church had struggled over watching what happened in Vietnam for a long time. And before that, he had struggled over his time in World War II and what he saw go down in the Pacific Theater. I could just mention briefly, like so many of us now, because of the public narrative around World War II, we remember World War II as a kind of sacred sacrifice by the greatest generation. We even remember the bombs being dropped, the nuclear bombs being dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki as necessary evils, right? But Frank Church didn't really see it that way. Those were things that really depressed him. And he hoped that they at least would make evident that there had to be a confederacy of nations or a conglomerate of nations to come together to deal with catastrophe, right? And so I mentioned that. And what we also didn't talk about was that before Frank Church came to the Senate, he had a bout of testicular cancer. He ultimately would die very young of cancer. And he almost died before his life ever took off when he came back from World War II. And so he had this whole life history of both extraordinary success and getting to do things that no one gets to do, like be elected to the Senate, and these things that really pained him and made him struggle and deal with things. And so for Church, when we're coming into the 1970s and Watergate, he saw a situation where government had been behaving badly for a long time. And he understood full well that life was not all roses and daisies all the time. Watergate to him wasn't something that just happened because a president had been behaving badly. It wasn't something that happened because a president had tried to grab too much power or win an election the president probably was going to win anyway. It was for Frank Church another in a long stream of scandals. Church believed secrecy, divisiveness, and intrigue had spread like an ugly web across the nation, and that political leaders were going to use undemocratic tactics in the United States the same as they used them across the world, like in things like the Gulf of Tonkin, as dirty tricks to get what they wanted. It's hard for me to draw like a straight line from Watergate to Church's leadership of the Senate committee, except that to say that the Watergate Commission, among the things, it didn't just expose like the secret tapes, it also revealed that the executive branch had directed national intelligence agencies to carry out constitutionally questionable domestic security things, right? So the Watergate Commission also pointed out that intelligence agencies were acting badly.
Yeah, there were hints of the larger picture in the Watergate investigation.
Right.
Also in 1970, a former Army counterintelligence captain published some damaging revelations as well in the Washington Monthly about a nationwide domestic intelligence program to monitor political dissent. And then Sam Ervin, who would then later on do the Watergate Senate committee, he chaired a committee to look into that revelation about what the Army captain brought up back in 1971. So we're still a couple of years before the Church Committee. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt there. But
No. I appreciate that a lot. So around this time, Church starts developing this reputation on Capitol Hill as a bit of a moralist, right? Some of the people who didn't like him as well as others, joke that he took his last name Church a little too seriously. There's a moment in his biography where some people say maybe he should change it from church to cathedral, right? Because he's just like such a moralist and so sure that he has the high ground. And he's also jockeying on the national stage at this point. He does launch a presidential run in 1976 that doesn't go really far, but it was surprisingly successful for a brief moment. And then in 74, an article comes out by Seymour Hersh.
Yeah, front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, that exposes a program of domestic surveillance against anti-war activists. Congress takes this investigative journalism pretty seriously, not immediately, but within a couple months. And the Senate decides to investigate. Church wants to be the leader of the committee. Some accounts suggest that, he pounded down Mike Mansfield's door, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the point. Other reports that Mansfield really actually wanted Phil Hart to be the leader. Hart couldn't do it because of health reasons, and so Church got the job.
Well, as historians say, this was a concentrated period. And your answer raises so many issues just about the climate in the country, the sense that trust was breaking down among the American people, trust in their institutions. It seems so crazy to think this today, but in those days, people did believe what the government told them. The Vietnam War helped shatter a lot of that, right? The media went along with what the government had been saying during the Vietnam War. Wasn't there a famous moment, actually, when, it was the Tet Offensive, when Walter Cronkite gets up in the newsroom and says, I thought we were winning this war. We were told we were winning this war. How could this be possible? The Tet Offensive in 1968. Sorry to digress about that, but what I'm trying to say is this is a really important period to understand how Americans' attitudes and their trust in government changed.
The 1960s were the beginning of the fragmenting of what some historians refer to as like the liberal consensus, which is the idea that, especially beginning with FDR, that as long as the water is rising, everyone's boats will rise, and that everyone's life is going to gradually get better with the right kinds of government interventions and with the right kinds of worker protections, and that there is always already enough for everyone if you go out and you look for it. In the aftermath of FDR, even Republican presidents essentially operated as Keynesian leaders, right? So Dwight D. Eisenhower is a Republican, but he builds the American highway system, and he leaves office warning about the military-industrial complex.
Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
Well, in the 1960s, the fabric of that quilt is starting to fray because you have blacks in the South, especially, get on television and the American public all of a sudden has to encounter pictures of blacks in the South getting fire hosed and beat up essentially for existing, right? For sitting at lunch counters or for trying to cross bridges in Selma. And they have to encounter the fact that what is happening in white America is different than what is happening in Black America. And Black Americans are not having the same experience of progress. You have the war that is happening on people's television screens. It's not possible to believe what is being told to them because not only do they see it on their screens, but their sons and their friends are beginning to be drafted, and they're having to go fight a war that is not well articulated, that they're even being told is not a war.
This is the credibility gap, right?
Exactly.
That's where that term comes from.
And so the wartime prosperity economy is starting to slow down, so that by the early 1970s, right, you have Japan and you have Germany. These countries are coming back on the scene with cars and with inventions, with wares to sell, such that the American economy is not completely dominant and is not able to offer the same kinds of unstoppable profits and unstoppable perks and unstoppable wage growth that has been the case. And so the promise of that liberal consensus, there is this sense in the American populace that perhaps that prosperity is not as widely dispersed and that there is risk that is inherent in the promise, right? The risk that your son will wind up in war, the risk that your son or daughter will join a freedom ride and go down south and wind up in some kind of situation against Southern police, all kinds of things that can go on. And so the idyllic notion of what the nation is supposed to be is very different than the lived experience of what's happening. And that is going to crash hard into what goes down, especially with Watergate and the ending of Vietnam.
You know, sometimes when we look back at past eras, there could be a gloss or an illusion of bipartisanship and unity and people coming together to solve this terrible problem. That's not entirely wrong, right? Because the Church Committee was approved by a large bipartisan majority. The vote was something like, 80-something to 4. But this still was a very partisan time. This was a divisive issue to get into, because this is really the first time, right, that the Senate ever looks at investigating these institutions, FBI, NSA, and CIA.
There's a lot at risk with this vote because nothing had ever been done like it before. People felt sure, senators felt sure that attacks and investigations on federal law enforcement and national security had a high potential of going down poorly with their constituents and going down poorly with the individuals who were probably most likely to vote. It's a very delicate topic to talk about now, but it's worth mentioning. It was a delicate vote and it made people nervous, in large part because the Senate at this point was made up mostly of aged 50-plus wealthy white men who were mostly worried about their wealthy suburban white constituents, many of whom were likely to have a good impression of federal law enforcement and federal spying agencies.
The G-men, right?
Yeah. And many of whom were likely to think, well, okay, so maybe I don't want these spy agencies to wreck civil liberties, but they're spying on anti-war activists.
Yeah, anti-war activists were not popular people. Martin Luther King wasn't a necessarily popular person either, right? And he was being eavesdropped on, yeah.
Precisely. And so it meant upsetting their voters, or had the potential to upset their voters, because they were working to defend people who were not necessarily popular. And people who would say things like we say now, what do I care if the NSA looks at my cell phone records? I'm not doing anything wrong, right? It can be hard to defend rights in the abstract when people think that the only ones who might be harmed are those who, quote unquote, deserve it.
So let's talk about a few of the things that the Church Committee looked into and what they found. We can't cover all of it in one podcast, but the NSA was doing something called Project Minaret. What was that?
The hearings exposed secret, probably illegal wiretapping, bugging, and harassment of American citizens, right? Including Supreme Court justices, reporters, government officials. And they said they were doing it to collect intelligence about threats to national security. A lot of people know this colloquially, but the most famous example was that they wiretapped Martin Luther King Jr., that J. Edgar Hoover did that mostly to try to prove that he was not working towards social justice. He was not working toward peace, but he was actually part of a communist conspiracy and that people shouldn't take him seriously.
Well, that sounds nuts, but we live in an age of nuttiness today. The CIA, it was revealed that it had been involved in assassinations and coups in other countries, right?
They found evidence that the government had participated in attempts on the lives of, Fidel Castro of Cuba, of the president of the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo, that they had attempted to take the life of the prime minister of the Congo.
And the CIA had been involved in coup d'etat in Guatemala, Iran. I don't know if those came under the Church Committee's purview, but the FBI was doing something called COINTELPRO. What was that all about? Well, that was the code name for their operation.
More weird surveillance, feminist organizations and Communist Party organizations and anti-Vietnam War organizers and civil rights organizers and people involved in the Black Power movement. The big question for listeners, the big question that I always point my students to here is, these were people at the time who we would point to, who would have been pointed to, and they would have said, yeah, we're tracking these people because they might be enemies of the state. They might mean to do harm to the state. And that was the justification that would have been given. And we look back now, and feminists deserve to be wiretapped because they believe that women deserve equal status in society. What does it mean when the government begins to surveil you because they don't like your ideas, right? And that's what was going on here.
Among those who were not happy with the congressional investigations was a man who was in charge of the CIA for 1 year, George H.W. Bush. Reading from Timothy Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, which is a terrific book about the history of the CIA, page 404, Bush contended, actually in an interview with the author, a written response to the author. So Weiner reached out to Bush. This is many years, of course, after the fact. He said that the congressional investigations did long-lasting damage to the agency. They set back our liaison relationships around the world. The CIA's links with foreign intelligence services, the source of so much of the information it gathered, and they caused many people abroad to pull away from cooperating with the CIA. And worst of all, Bush said, they devastated the morale of perhaps the finest group of public servants this country has. Well, that is a vote of confidence for the CIA, which, of course, as we've established, was up to horrible things all over the world. So all these revelations come out. What's the American people's response? There must have been some support for the committee because a raft of reforms come right after it, right?
It's really hard to figure out what was the public reaction. In the last few weeks, as this has been really hot in the news, I've looked back at, I was in our library looking at microfilm and there's articles about it, but what there aren't is old polls to look at. What did you think of the Church Committee findings? But what we can look at is the historical record and what you just said, which is that the committee led to real reform. And those reforms have held, which I think tells us that despite the fact that I think it did take courage on the part of the committee to do this, the people deemed it necessary to have these reforms, right?
And we get the FISA court out of this, which is in the news again because there have been problems with it, of course.
And the committee underscored and brought to people's attention that the Fourth Amendment that protects us from illegal searches and seizures, that the Fourth Amendment, it really does matter, right? And that there are these legislations that came of it, right? The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, a permanent committee to oversee the intelligence agencies, that Congress oversees intelligence. Intelligence doesn't oversee Congress, and the FISA courts, and a term limit of 10 years on the FBI director so that you can't have presidents for decades using an FBI director like Hoover to spy on the American people, to spy on so-called enemies of the state.
How long was Hoover head of the FBI again? It was decades. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but yeah, it was a long time. I had forgotten.
It was a long time.
Yeah, the 10-year term limit. So a question that resonates today. Church was not trying to destroy our agencies. He wanted to reform them. He also wasn't interested in, publicly humiliating them. Many of the hearings were held private, and they weren't all on television, right? He didn't want it to become a media circus.
Right. Well, one of my favorite parts of this story, and the more I read about it and the more I learn about it and the more I have the privilege of holding this chair, is that as the committee did its work and as it unfolded and as he worked in concert with John Tower of Texas to co-chair the committee, members of his own party, members of the Democratic Party, criticized him for being too willing to work with the other side, for being too willing to hear their concerns, to bring their wishes into the committee charter, for being too willing to pay attention to what they thought might go wrong. That kind of bipartisanship, that kind of an instinct to earn public legitimacy for what they were going to do, That is exactly what's absent in most of what this kind of committee work is doing in the Congress today. Right?
Barry Goldwater, arch conservative, was on the Church Committee.
Barry Goldwater was exactly correct. And Church, from the start, most of it, the first 9 months of the committee, there were no cameras there at all. Now, there was no C-SPAN then, even, to just like turn the cameras on and be there. So it wasn't the same kind of media environment. We have to remember that Newt Gingrich was the one who made C-SPAN in the early 90s when he just started making his speeches for C-SPAN, and it kind of went out from there. Before that, there wasn't the kind of camera action all the time that we have now anyway. But they didn't have a media circus. They weren't doing it for the cameras. They weren't doing it even to earn or lose votes or to get constituents all riled up to have rallies in the park about intelligence. They were really having this committee to find out what was going on, right? Seymour Hersh had done this piece of investigative journalism that discovered surveillance against anti-war activists that looked to be in violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And that was sort of the final straw, and they wanted to know what was happening. And it's actually breaks my heart as a media scholar and a media historian to say that I can't really imagine Congress reacting to investigative journalism in the same way, which says so much about the breakdown in our public sphere.
A different media environment, to say the least. It's a different universe right now, right? Because this is going to play, talking about the new Church Committee, which will be headed by Jim Jordan, this is going to play really well on certain cable networks and maybe not at all on others. Let me share with you something that Peter Fenn wrote, an op-ed in The Hill. He is a Democrat. He worked on the Church Committee as a young staffer all those years ago when he was 27 years old. He writes in The Hill, "This committee will itself be a partisan weapon and resemble the demagogue Joe McCarthy more than Kevin McCarthy. It will more likely resemble the old House Un-American Activities Committee, not the Church Committee. In a very real sense, this will be a weapon targeting democracy itself in a crass and partisan manner, not an effort to save our democracy." But he goes on to say, and I raised this point briefly before about the problems with the FISA court today, he says, "It is sad because one could argue there is a need for a new Church Committee that looks at legislation of 50 years ago. Assumptions about technology and privacy and national security as they have changed so radically over the last half century, and the role of our intelligence agencies in the modern age." What do you think of that?
Peter Fenn is wonderful. He's actually on the board of directors for the Frank Institute here and is a beloved mentor and helps me learn about Frank Church all the time. So I
didn't know that.
I appreciate you bringing Peter into the conversation. What you're raising is the difference between accountability and retribution. There is always a need to hold people in power to account, right? People with power, people in government, human beings themselves, and institutions are always in danger of abusing their power and finding loopholes and doing things like has happened with the FISA court that they should not do. And we need a Congress, we need committees like the Church Committee to engage in oversight. Because I, for one, take my Fourth Amendment rights very seriously. I take all my rights very seriously, right? I don't want the police to just knock on my door and come inside my house and have a look around whenever they want. And I don't want them to do that with my digital files either, even though I don't think I'm doing anything wrong.
And I don't want our intelligence services doing torture like they did during the global war on terrorism.
Precisely. But, there is a real difference to having accountability and engaging in retribution or in defending people who do things that we know or that we have watched with our own eyes violate what it means to be an American, violate what it means to be a citizen, or to act in defense of those who stormed our Capitol on January 6th. There is good reason to suspect that part of the reason that Kevin McCarthy, is calling for the creation of this committee or why this committee has been formed is because he wanted to be Speaker of the House, and it's part of the concessions that he made to earn that position. And that just doesn't feel at all like what happened with the First Church Committee, where there were evidences of real abuses, there were external sources that came, and that they followed the evidence, right? And this is what I tell my students all the time. I have no interest in trying to persuade you what your worldview should be. I don't have any interest in telling you how you should vote. It's not important to me who your political heroes are. It is important to me that you know what the evidence is, and that when you know what the evidence is and you take a position, you can defend it. What's happening is that we have political leaders right now who appear willing to dismiss evidence like the January 6th Commission in favor just wanting to maintain themselves in good stead with those who are behaving in ways that actually feel like they maybe should be checked in defense of the country.
I'll read from a news article here to wrap up, and you can offer your thoughts on this. When it comes to what the Church Committee did in the 1970s, comparing that to what Jim Jordan himself has said he's interested in doing now. He has said that there's bias in federal law enforcement against conservatives. Obviously, Republicans were very unhappy with the investigations into Donald Trump. And now that the GOP is in the majority, he says he plans to use his gavel and his subpoena power to expand his inquiries, including searching for evidence that federal workers have become too politicized and demanding documents about ongoing criminal investigations. There are also reports that the House GOP wants to bring Twitter's executives, or former executives now, in front of Congress to explain their content moderation policies, obviously the Hunter Biden laptop story and all of that. Whether this is right or wrong, this is not what the Church Committee was doing 50 years ago.
The concern I have about the language Jim Jordan is raising and the issues that he's raising is that he seems to be suggesting that people who have dedicated their lives to government have targeted and are maybe still targeting right of center individuals and groups. He's trying to say that it's conservatives, but I know plenty of conservatives who are not being targeted, right? So he is lumping together conservatives with individuals who are really like right-wing militia groups, individuals who participated and have been held to account for their participation in the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol, right? That's the first thing. And then the second thing, what is the evidence? Because what the Church Committee found is that you had people, you had those feminist groups, you had Martin Luther King Jr., you had Muhammad Ali, you had Supreme Court justices, people who were just engaged in their, many times like their First Amendment rights to petition the government for a redress of evil, or Supreme Court justices who were just writing opinions. This has nothing to do with what Jim Jordan is talking about. And that's the concern, because we need good people to actually work to the good of the government. And we also need a faithful interpretation of the record of the past. The last thing I'll say, at the risk of talking too long, is that
that's a podcast. It can go on forever. Go ahead.
Well, I always remind my students, and it makes me feel a little bit like, I also study religious conservatives, and so I spend a lot of time listening to pastors. And so sometimes I feel like I take on a tone of a pastor. But we often, because some people get to be in Washington doing the work of government, we forget that the people are the government, right? That our representatives answer to us. We don't answer to them. That's why we teach history, because history is not facts. History, that's an encyclopedia. History is the interpretation of the record of the past. And it's not just our heroic moments. History also includes the times that we make mistakes. And when we don't have fidelity to the mistakes we've made, right? When we don't hold those things in truth and in good stead, the times we got it wrong. And what the Church Committee discovered was when the intelligence agencies got it wrong. When we don't hold those mistakes in good stead, then we are not interpreting the past fairly and truthfully. And what Jim Jordan is engaged in right now, and what Kevin McCarthy are engaged in right now, is an effort to interpret the past, to interpret January 6th unfaithfully. And that is a mischaracterization of history, and it is trying to tell our American narrative in a way that will harm us all as we move toward the future.
Sam Martin, the Frank and Bethine Church Endowed Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University in Idaho. We thank you for your insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to connect past and present again. You think the media is partisan today? Well, you ever look at a pamphlet or a newspaper from the 1790s or the 1850s? We've always had a partisan press. Well, not always. Well, maybe you disagree with that too. We're going to get into it next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.